Hello, and welcome to Devlog number 35. I've been absolutely itching to make this one because I'm going to say right at the start that I have never been more confident in an update than I am at this point for carriers. For those of you who haven't been testers for our previous major updates, the modular missile update and the OSP update really only came together at the absolute last minute. And with the OSP update in particular, it took a lot of work afterwards to really make it playable. But with the carriers update, we found the fun surprisingly fast. We've been doing internal test games about 2 weeks at this point, and despite the plethora of bugs, and you'll see plenty of errors pop up in the video in the background, it's coming together really well and we're already having a lot of fun. I think one of the biggest concerns that a lot of players have about this update is that they're worried that it's going to transform the game completely, and that is absolutely a concern that I had as well. While I think it's impossible to add something like carriers to the game without changing it in some way, I am happy to say that after the first few weeks of testing, it's shown that the game is still absolutely recognizable as Nebulous, but with some new, cool features added on. This video is going to be split into two parts, the first half covering most of the new toys that you're going to find in the update, and then the second half I'm going to go into detail on all of the initial balancing stuff and changes that we've made in the first 2 weeks. But in order to really understand how craft work and what makes them unique, we need to go to the fleet editor first and look at the new Spacecraft designer. The Spacecraft designer is somewhat similar to the missile designer, but with a few key differences. You can still add designs to your fleet and create templates so that you can reuse them, but over on the right you'll notice the distinction between fixed components and configured mission profiles. Craft sockets are divided into two different types, the fixed kind and the variable kind. The fixed kind are what you choose in the craft editor, and whatever you select is what's going to be permanently fixed to the craft's body in battle, and you can't change that. So for example, the AN Interceptor has a nose gun, and it also has a belly bay that you can change between either an S1 missile bay or an S2 missile bay. When we select one of the mission profiles for this craft design, we can see all of the loadout slots that are available. These slots are always the same no matter what's installed, but what's available under each slot changes depending on what's installed. Because I have the S2 bay installed, the B1 through B8 slot are completely taken up by that single S2 missile that it contains, and if I had the S1 bay, I'd get 8 S1 slots. Now, the wing slots on this interceptor are actually a variable socket, which means that if I unload all of these missiles, I can now choose wing pods that go on as well, and that locks me out of putting missiles on those wings. I had originally planned for the wing pylons or whatever EW pods you had to be a fixed socket the way that the gun or the missile bay is. But those things are configurable during pre-flight in the real world, and so it just adds so much more flexibility to be able to swap out missile pylons for jamming pods or drop tanks. And after seeing it in action, I'm really glad that I took the time to make that system. And you can configure any number of these loadouts that you want, so if we click down through the list, you can see how each loadout varies. On the OSP side, we can see how the core design principles of their craft differ from the Alliance ones in that the OSP craft are almost entirely configurable during pre-flight. For the OSP Strike Fighter, for example, everything except for the nose gun is configurable at pre-flight before it launches from the carrier. And you can see all the options here ranging from EW pods and fuel tanks to kinetic bombs to size 1 missiles to size 2 missiles to rocket pods, and you can mix and match those however you want. So by deselecting the size 1 missiles from the wing tops, I can add S2 missiles there instead, and I can mix strike capability with anti-craft capability. And I can do that on the same space frame design that I would also be able to send out with 16 S1s if I wanted to, or 4 S2s. The Alliance, on the other hand, trades that flexibility for the reduced RCS of a missile bay. And the OSP bomber is the same way, where I can choose a loadout that either carries 4 torpedoes or 8 S2s on the same space frame, depending on what I need. Moving on to the actual in-game assets, this is the Alliance's Levy-class escort carrier. I'm really happy with this one. I think it's a really neat design. The asymmetry is really interesting. I like the side-mounted bridge. This one was pretty tough in terms of operational constraints for how many pads it needed to have and deck space and that kind of stuff, as well as being able to have enough defensive coverage without making it totally independent of other ships or a cap. And for reference, it's just a little bit larger than an Axford. It has 6 landing pads on the top deck. The small ones that you see in an L shape are actually the C4 pads that you saw in the last devlog for the combination hangar launch pad. They fit things like the interceptor and the skiff that you've already seen. These large pads in the center carry the larger space frames that we're going to talk about in a second. If these were mounts, they would actually be like a C6 size, but they are integrated into the hull, so you can't just put whatever you want on them. We thought about putting some of the pads on the bottom of the hull, but given how thin it is and how deep the pads go, there actually wasn't really room where the pads met up in order to put actual hangar space, so we ended up leaving them all on the top. And we also put a rotating radar on the top and bottom, which is different from the Alliance's normal radar panels. I think this helps contribute to the idea that this is a backline ship. It doesn't have the best radar coverage. It's not meant to be in frontline combat, and we've used rotating radars on some of the other Alliance hulls that we did for Conquest that are meant to be backline. And I just love the way Top Plate looks. It's my favorite radar. That probably says something about who I am as a person, that I have a favorite radar, but I did make this game. So now we've got a full complement of all the different types of AN craft orbiting the carrier so that we can show you the actual models. And just to note, the Levy is final art, but everything else you're going to see in this video is still development graphics. The models aren't done, the textures certainly aren't done. I saw a comment about the last devlog where someone said, I hope they choose a better color than that ugly orange for the launch pads. Those are just prototype grid textures. We're going to get actual textures for everything eventually, obviously. First up, we have the AN Interceptor, or the Tonto, which you've seen before and the model hasn't really changed, but it does have the glide bombs equipped, which we're going to talk about later. The skiff has also moved further in the art pipeline. It's much closer to what its final shape is going to look like, and it's not going to have these glowing blue windows. We're probably going to go more with like a gold-tinted space helmet kind of glass, or maybe like a dark black glass. These glowing patches are also where the decals for the thrusters are going to go, just so that you can see where they are. I saw a number of people on the last video wishing for thrusters, and we actually do have them on the Tonto already. They're actually geometry embedded in the model, but they're not very noticeable, so I think we're probably going to get rid of those and switch everything over to decals because they're much clearer. The skiff has kind of lagged behind in development a little bit, but we have some cool ideas for what we want to add in terms of utility. Next up is the Alliance's Claymore bomber, and I really like the design of this one with the flying wing and the big body. It's also got a really cool double stack offset cockpit. And then on the bottom here, it has either an S2 missile bay or an S3 missile bay. You have to choose one of the two. And then to round out the list, we've got the Sundial Seawacker Spaceborne Early Warning and Control. This is essentially equivalent to a Spyglass Corvette. It's almost as expensive as one, but it's much more fragile, although it's a lot harder to see. I really love all these designs, but I especially love this one. On the OSP side, we've got the Moorlines Fleet Carrier configuration. You can install these hangar bays in your container banks, and that gives you spacecraft carrying capability, and they resize depending on the size of the socket that they're in. And each of these gives you 3 pads, 2 small and 1 large, which gives you a lot more launching capability than the Alliance does. And those pads have the special capability that they can also draw craft from internal hangars as well as just the container bank hangars. So basically the OSP gets more carrying capacity of more flexible spacecraft, but with the penalty of slower loading times because their deck crews are not as well trained as the Alliance's are. And it's been really interesting to see that the addition of the Moorline carrier variant has had our testers all jumping to play OSP. That team fills up way faster than the Alliance one does now. And I think that's a really good sign because the Alliance has always been more popular despite changes that we've made to the OSP. But the Alliance is good at a lot of stuff. They're the missile faction and the gun faction and the armor faction, and so we wanted to give the Protectorate something special and make them the carrier faction, which is why they get the fleet carrier, even if it is a converted one, versus the Alliance's escort carrier. And why they get the more flexible, dedicated spacecraft that can be configured in a lot of different ways compared to the Alliance's more specific, bespoke ones. And speaking of OSP craft, first up is what we're calling the Strike Fighter, which is tentative name the Barracuda. This one in the middle here is configured with rocket pods, so it's got 3 rockets in each one of those pods, and they're smaller than the R2 Piranha rockets that you use on the shuttles, but they are very fast and do quite a bit of damage. Over here we've got a space superiority loadout with pylons full of S1s. Then one configured for size 2 missile bombing runs, so it carries 4 of those. And finally, over on the other side, we've got a mixed load where it's carrying 2 size 2 missiles on the bottom and 8 S1s on the top, so it can both do strike missions and cap missions. The OSP bomber, tentative name Sturgeon. This one's a really cool design as well, kind of like a space hind. I really like the struts that form the wings with the thrusters on the outside that give a lot of leverage, and it's got these 4 large pylons that can be configured to carry a lot of different stuff. This one specifically is carrying 2 large rocket pods, which have 10 rockets each. This bomber, on the other hand, has 4 size 3 torpedoes that it's carrying, and then the third one in the formation is carrying 8 size 2 missiles. One of the really unique things about bombers is that most craft can only have 1 command missile in flight at a time, whereas fully autonomous missiles, they can just dump any number depending on the setting that you have. This makes it so that the optimal air-to-air missile is not just a command S1, because that would be really boring. Bombers, on the other hand, have no such limitation, so they can dump 8 command S2s or 4 command S3s at once. And then finally, we've got the OSP Scout, tentative name Pike. This is actually a surprisingly good dogfighter because it's small and nimble and very hard to detect. But I've got one configured with 4 S1s and a gun, and then this one also has this special unique capability. These purple boxes on either side are EO targeting pods. These grant the scout the very special capability to designate targets. So instead of right-clicking and attacking, I can hold shift and designate this target, and when I do that, it instantly gives my whole team vision of that target. And these scouts are going to do a tight orbit here while they train the pod on it, and it's not going to give quite a lock, but it gives a really accurate track that you can still get gunfire on. You've probably noticed that the OSP doesn't have a CWAC equivalent, and that's because they already have one in the form of the Huntress shuttle. It's fast, it can provide good radar tracks, and it can move with craft, but we still wanted to give the OSP some unique scouting capability, and so far this one has been a big hit. And finally, there's one more new toy to show off that I just finished working on this morning. Believe it or not, size 2 defensive missiles are actually a thing now, and they perform really well. However, this presents kind of a major problem because the OSP doesn't have access to size 2 VLS, that's an Alliance thing. So they don't have the ability to on-demand fire defensive S2s whenever they need them, or if they use MLS, then if they miss, it takes a long time to reload and they can't use the missile type that they want immediately. So I said to the testers, half joking, why don't I just add a one-armed bandit? And then I thought about it for a little bit, and I was like, actually, that's kind of a good idea. OSP has great mag depth, they have lots of missiles that are already sitting in there. It wouldn't provide the same weight of fire as MLS or VLS can, but it does provide on-demand fire because it can use the same missile pooling system that VLS does. So I put together a prototype and it actually works really well, not to mention I could just sit here and watch it fire all day. Alright, that's all the new toys, so I hope you enjoyed that look. Now let's talk about the hard stuff, which is balance testing. I've learned a lot over the last 2.5 years, so with this update I decided that I was going to do things a little different. Previously, I've made test builds available to our internal testers pretty frequently, but with carriers I decided that I wasn't going to do that until almost everything was implemented. I could have given them a build back when it was just the C4 hangar and a half-working interceptor and skiff, and they probably would have been organizing games around that. And while it's great that they're enthusiastic and engaged, I think a lot of developers would call me spoiled for having community testers who are as active as mine are. But nothing would have been learned from those games. Every piece of feedback or concern would have been responded to with, well, it's going to change when X feature or Y feature gets implemented. So I kept the build private until we had a carrier for each faction and all of the craft designs for each faction. And that definitely turned out to be the right move because the speed at which we've iterated on the issues that we've found and how quickly we've converged to a really good feeling game is something that's never happened in any of the updates before. Just over 2 weeks ago, I gave them the first build and I said, let's try it out. We played 2 test games on Monday, obviously ran into a ton of bugs and crashes, but immediately identified a core issue in that the pace of the game had dramatically sped up. On Tuesday, I fixed something like 40 bugs and then cut the speed of all of the craft down drastically. We played 3 more test games on Wednesday and saw that the pace of the game had returned pretty much to the baseline that we expect on the main branch. And most importantly, the scout and sensor war was still there. From those 3 games, we also identified a couple more core issues. The first and most important was loiter time. I had originally not intended to do fuel limits for craft because I thought that it would be really unfun if you were in the middle of a bombing run and then oops, I'm out of fuel, gotta turn around. But fuel is a really important consideration in carrier operations, and without it we just ended up with giant blobs of fighters with infinite loiter time patrolling around the map with no limits. So I added a fuel mechanic implemented as bingo time rather than an actual hard fuel number. This defines how long your craft can stay up. You can also turn on hard burn or H burn, and they can go 1.5 times their speed, but they'll also get like 2.5 times the fuel consumption. So you can get somewhere fast, but you'll also reduce your loiter time significantly. Your carrier has functionally infinite fuel storage, so you're never not going to be able to launch craft because you're out of fuel. And most importantly, you're never going to lose craft because you ran out of fuel. If your flight is on the other side of the map and they run out of fuel, they'll just automatically pathfind back to the carrier and dock, and you're not going to run out even if it takes them a long time to get back. I also removed flight control limits, hoping that fuel would be enough of a control to keep the number of craft in the battle space at any given time down. Though you may still see the flight count somewhere on the UI because I just haven't deleted that UI element, it doesn't do anything. And this worked really well. It immediately made carriers feel not only better for the people playing the carriers, but everybody else in the game as well. It made it so that carrier play was not just get all your craft in space and then have them patrol around the map. It changed it to much more of a sortie-oriented gameplay. You pick a target or an objective, you pick the craft you want to conduct it, you pick the appropriate mission profile, you launch them, send them to the target area, they conduct the mission, and then they return to base and repeat. And that's especially interesting in the mid to late game when you've got flights returning and flights launching and the traffic management and the deck crews doing post-flight on some craft and pre-flight on others. Overall, I think it's the best change that we've made to the update so far, and I'm really glad the flight limit is gone. It wasn't very long-lived at all, because that was very contrived and also opened up a lot of weird edge cases, like you can't merge craft from different ships because the flight count is ship dependent. And it also made it so that I had to put restrictions on how many craft could be in a group so that you can't cheese the flight limit by just merging everything into a single group, which helped address the second issue that we identified, which was micro hell. The first couple test games, there was absolutely no autonomy for the spacecraft, which turned out to be very bad. They would happily idly orbit there until you gave them an order, even if they were under attack, which when you've got a bunch of flights out all in different places is very taxing on the carrier player. So it was obvious that autonomy was needed sooner rather than later, so I immediately started implementing that. And that includes important core behaviors like stance, so craft will go attack things that are threatening units that they're guarding, for example, or they'll automatically engage whatever's attacking them. The ability to target individual subsystems on ships. Previously, they didn't know when they were being threatened by guns, so two flights would close on each other and spray 20mm and everyone would just die, so now they know when they're being threatened by a gun and they'll take evasive action appropriately. Knowing what weapons to use versus specific targets is also important, so when you right-click a ship, for example, it will deauthorize all the weapons that are not really ideal for that target, or if you target craft, it'll only enable the weapons that are appropriate for that target unless you manually enable them after. They're also smart about when to use their missiles now, so if a seeker is rear aspect only, like the Wake Seeker, then it will only use it when it has rear aspect on the target. And then finally, to substantially reduce clicks, I removed the limit on the number of craft that can be in any given group. This makes it so that all the craft of the same type that are in an area conducting a mission can be grouped together, so you only need to select one and give them orders instead of 3 groups of 5, for example. And there's still plenty of pressure to split your craft up and send them to different areas, because it's the same way that you can have your whole team ball up their ships in one location, and yeah, they're pretty safe, but you also lose map presence everywhere else, and you can't support your team. So after the games on Wednesday, I wrote a gigantic 7,000 character essay to my testers describing the problems that we'd identified and the proposed solutions that we just discussed. I spent the next couple days after that implementing all of those changes, and then we did a couple more test games over the weekend, and the game was instantly better. We had a lot of fun playing them. Obviously, there's still some bugs that we're working around, and they can cause a lot of annoyance, but it's amazing how quickly we've converged on a great game state. And that would not have been possible without all of the experience that we've gathered over the last couple major updates, both as developers and as testers, and from the great feedback that the testers are giving. If you'd like to be a tester and you either didn't see the announcement or aren't in the Discord, our applications for carrier-specific testers are now open, and they're going to continue until Friday the 6th. This testing period is turning out to be a lot of fun, actually, compared to what we've been through in the past. It's certainly no cakewalk. A game as complex as this and a game that people are as invested in as this is obviously going to have a lot of different strong opinions, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, both in terms of fixing the bugs and making everything stable and making sure that everything is in a good balanced state. But I am very confident that we're going to make it there sooner rather than later. That's about it for this devlog. Thanks for watching.